Welcome to Bloomberg. My name is Chris Michelle, and I'm our America's Head of Diversity and Inclusion. And here at the firm, we believe in bringing together diverse perspectives to engage in meaningful dialogue to find innovative solutions that have positive impacts on our business and our society as a whole. We strive to partner, collaborate with, and learn from our strategic partners and other organizations to drive innovation wherever we can, and tonight is no exception. On behalf of the Bloomberg Diversity and Inclusion team, we're excited to host WAYE, weekly advice for the young entrepreneur for thought-provoking discussion. Artificial intelligence is having an outsized impact on entire industries, individual businesses, and our personal lives. Our guests this evening will dive deep on a future in which AI will play a significant role in what that all may mean. My challenge to you this evening is to listen to the insights of our esteemed panel and consider not only how you'll move forward into this brave new world, but also how you can share this knowledge with others to enhance their transition. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for the evening, the founder and CEO of WAYE, Sinead Bovell. Ms. Bovell holds a BBA in Finance and Chemistry from Wilfrid Laurier University and an MBA from the University of Toronto. She's a very accomplished woman indeed. Please join me in welcoming her, and thank you again for being with us at Bloomberg this evening.
Thank you so much for joining me here today. I am so excited for this evening's conversation. But I first want to start with saying thank you to Bloomberg for opening your doors to WAYE. For anybody that knows me, you know that I read Bloomberg religiously. So there's no better place that I can think of having this conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sinead Bovell, and I am the founder of WAYE, an organization that bridges the gap between young entrepreneurs and the digital future. A future in which many of the jobs that we see today will be replaced by technology. Put up your hand if this is your first WAYE Talk. Wow. Well, welcome to the WAYE Talks community. We're really excited to have you. And so what are WAYE Talks? They're a monthly conversation where we challenge how we think about the future. We immerse ourselves at the intersection of business and technology and ask, what else could be possible? So without further ado, let's kick off tonight's conversation. 70 years ago, Alan Turing asked the question, can machines think? This was decades before the invention of the personal computer. His assertion was radical, and it was met with resistance by scientists across the world. But we sit here today and realize that his question wasn't radical at all. It actually was advanced and possessed a complete understanding of technology's potential. Today we ask a different set of questions, that we have a different set of answers. Today we ask a different set of questions. Can artificial intelligence help us combat climate change? Can it help us cure the incurable? Can it help us to build a more efficient world? And if so, what becomes of humanity's purpose? And what are the odds of the unintended consequences? Regardless of what you believe to be true about the future, the best thing we can do is prepare for it. And there's no better way to prepare than with tonight's experts. Our first panelist is an AI editorial engineer here at Bloomberg. Her work involves AI so precisely that one change in code could move financial markets across the world. Our second panelist is the Vice President of Data and AI Expert Services and Learning at IBM. Her work single-handedly accelerates the adoption of AI enterprises' capabilities across the world. Our third and final panelist is a professor and resident expert of artificial intelligence. In 2016, he published a framework that has been one of the most referenced when it comes to AI. When is it time to trust robots, and when is it not? Please welcome tonight's incredible panel. so excited to be interviewing this incredible group of thought leaders on AI. And I think with artificial intelligence, the first step is getting an accurate understanding of what it really is. So professors, you probably explain this quite frequently. And so I would like to ask you, how would you describe artificial intelligence, define what artificial intelligence is, and what does it mean for a machine to be intelligent?
Well, those are, well, the second question is really profound, and you might get some disagreement with that. In terms of what AI really is, it's really the study of intelligence and the study of imbuing machines with intelligence, and a large part of that motivation comes from what makes humans intelligent. Your second question, which is, what makes a machine intelligent? You referred to Alan Turing. Turing has the famous Turing test, which, in my mind, was arguably first passed by a machine in the Jeopardy competition. I mean, that was the first time where one could have argued that if you put masks around the faces of the competitors, other than that question about the machine mistaking, thinking that Toronto is a U.S. city, other than that, you wouldn't have actually guessed that that was a machine.
Some people still might guess that.
Yeah, exactly right. So yeah, exactly. So so that was the first time that I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. I wouldn't have been able to tell who was human and who was machine. So that's one test, but arguably there's several other tests that one could come up with. But it's really sort of this, getting a machine to the point where you can't tell whether you're talking to a human or a machine. And that's a pretty tall order, because usually you can't. Within the first few minutes, you can tell you're talking to a machine. Now, just to put things in perspective, the Jeopardy thing was a very controlled sort of an environment, right? The subject matter was pretty open, but it was still fairly controlled. We still struggle with trying to get machines to carry on a conversation. It's very hard to do. Like now, Google Translate is very impressive, right? It translates from one language to another without understanding anything, right? But it does a pretty amazing job. But it can't really engage in a dialogue. So we're very far from any sort of true understanding of machines really, where we can say they're actually beginning to understand something. There's still a ways from that.
And how is the machine learning? And I posed the example with something like Netflix. Netflix is an example of AI that we use every single day. How is a machine, is it just through the examples that we give it, and it's able to, through the algorithms, understand what it is we're trying to do and use predictive analytics?
Yeah, so that's been sort of machine learning is really what's turbocharged AI, right? So AI has been through many, in my career, I've seen three sort of booms and busts, these hype cycles. And we're in the middle of a new hype cycle now. This is definitely a hype cycle. I think people have a totally inflated expectation of AI. But with machine learning, we've managed to do a lot with very little. And essentially what we've gotten the machine to do is to be able to learn from labeled data. And labeled data, I mean data that humans usually have labeled as being good, bad, up, down. That's a car, that's a tree, that's a human. And so we've actually provided machines with a lot of data. And with this data and with some sort of basic machinery from machine learning that's emerged over the last, I'd say, 3 decades, we can accomplish a lot. So and that's really been the magic that's kind of taken AI to the next place, is machine learning, and the ability to just learn from data and learn things that are useful. Even though the machine may not really understand much, right? The fact that it's managing to do some really useful stuff goes a long way.
And just to bring the speed up, machine learning is the algorithm that AI, artificial intelligence is based on. So it's a sub-factor within artificial intelligence. Teddy, you work at Bloomberg with AI in a quite incredible way.
what it is that you do and how you leverage AI.
Yes, so at Bloomberg, a lot of the machine learning that we do focuses on textual processing, so understanding natural language. We do also have structured information, but a lot of our content is structural, and I specifically work on a team that is trying to extract information. So whenever there's a financial event, let's say Apple releases its next year's sales forecast for like Apple iPhones, for example, or for revenue. We extract that information, the fact that there's an event, Apple is talking about its revenue, the amount, the fact that it's for next year, and other information. And then we use this information, these statistical models, to help the newsroom generate news stories, and to help them do so through automatic news story generation as well as semi-automatic fashion, so suggesting what sentences and what events are happening, so they can do things faster and they can focus on the why something is happening and what happens after the event, rather than the fact of what is happening. So, yeah.
And so for anyone that's a writer in the room, the stories actually are being written by AI. So artificial intelligence is taking that news story from Apple, extracting the info, putting the title on it, and then we read it. So there actually is no human process anymore in some of the stories that you'd be reading at Bloomberg. So if you're a writer in the room, I think that's really relevant for you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so to clarify, no. I just want to clarify something on that. So a small portion of the stories that we publish are fully automated, but the newsroom is then using the same story and extending, adding additional context. So we extracted financial information, what specifically is happening, adding some historical data, but in terms of why something is happening and all of the analysis and curiosity that really is in terms of trying to really piece together the events that are happening in the world, timelines and other things like that, that's where a lot of the analytics come in from, the journalists, and a lot of the information.
And for the machine to know what would make a gripping title, is that because you feed it examples of successful titles and then it learns this is what people like?
So the journalists control that completely. So they focus on the specific topic, what is an important topic, based on what they know of what, for example, Bloomberg clients want to read news about. So they both provide the annotations and the labels for the models that we train, as well as the final templates to say, hey, I want to generate news that is about a company and its future earnings, and what I want in the headline is the company name, the change in, let's say, the revenue, because that's the most important metric and things like that. So that's completely controlled by the journalist.
And so Rithmetic, IBM is most famous for Watson. And in case anybody in the room doesn't know who or what Watson is, why don't you tell them in some of the most fascinating things that Watson can do?
Yeah, I want to go back to the definition of artificial intelligence, because when we think about truly what artificial intelligence means to your everyday world, it is about understanding like humans do, having a machine understand like humans do, to reason, to make logical decisions, to learn like humans do, and to be able to interact, right? To be able to interact in the same way that humans do. Those are kind of like the four elements we think of. And as we do that, Watson really encapsulates all four of those components in a really consumable way, to where you can speak like a human does, you can see like a human does, you can process words like humans do, and then to be able to apply them to higher level tasks. And they're not necessarily deterministic in a way. When I say deterministic, it's not like you have a prescriptive outcome of yes or no, but you get answers that are more probabilistic in a way, that, you know, this image is 80% likely to be a cat or to be a building versus yes or no, because the machine may or may not have complete confidence that is what you think it is. So this whole notion of understanding, reasoning, learning, and interacting, and doing so in a way where you have probabilistic outcomes, really is what the definition is. And then, you know, what I like to think about is, you know, Watson can be applied to things like creating famous movie trailers, or creating different types of foods, or things, or music, things that you might have heard. but I personally like to think about the impact in terms of what it does to change the world in which we are. What it does to really interact with that, to where every time you're interacting with an assistant to be able to find answers to your questions, that in a customer care perspective, that you are getting answers immediately, and from a business standpoint, that's deflecting 99% of the calls that would go to a human, and improving that customer experience to where it's not just a customer support, but it's really about customer engagement to your client. It's about providing knowledge to everyone who is a knowledge worker to be able to have their whatever they're an expert in, that knowledge at their fingertips, whether they're a doctor, a lawyer, a journalist, to be able to have knowledge at your fingertips and to be able to use artificial intelligence to be able to bring that, to mitigate risk that may occur regardless of what industry. And so the applications of not only Watson, but just AI are pervasive through, I think, every industry, through every part of society that we know.
And for anyone who doesn't, put up your hand if you've never heard of Watson. So for those of you who don't know what Watson is the future of AI in a way. If you want to picture a robot, you can picture that. But it's an AI capable of diagnosing diseases, cooking, making music, writing films, directing films. Watson is kind of the be-all.
And I like to think about it as like making decisions on whether you should get a loan or not, making decisions on like things that you do every day that are essential to how the world works.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I've heard is that data is essentially the holy grail when it comes to artificial intelligence. These machines learn off of the data that we feed them. You can feed them examples, you can feed them models, they learn through that. Rithika, I have a question for you because I know IBM is paving the way when it comes to us building trust in AI. An algorithm was used for parole authorities in Florida to help them predict the risk level of an offender reoffending, or defendant reoffending, sorry. Black defendants were predicted to be at risk of reoffending 2x their white counterparts and to be misclassified. There was nothing wrong with the data, there was nothing wrong with the model, but there is a lot wrong with society and our biases. So how can we expect a model that is trained on the data from society to be better than society?
I think that's a fantastic question. I'll start with the point of the interaction between data and artificial intelligence. You can't have good artificial intelligence without good data, and you can't really extract meaning from what to be able to do with data or how to be able to get insights from data without good artificial intelligence. And I really think about them as a yin and yang relationship. And an example like what you talked about shows the importance of being able to not only have data that is good, but when you don't have data that is good, because historically you may have had bias in your data that you don't even know, it really starts to talk about the importance of being able to detect bias that exists in the algorithms that you code, that exists from the years of data that you may have had where there may have been biases in the way humans have interacted, right? And so, you know, where I work and where we work, this is probably one of the most critical things to be able to not only detect a bias, to be able to detect that if all other things were equal, that this person should have been granted parole. That is something that AI can do and does do for you today. And it is probably one of the most important things as you apply AI to be able to not only detect, but when you detect it, can you mitigate the bias? And that's something that from our research labs and from what we've been working on is probably one of the most important topics in AI today. How do you adhere to the ethics that you should have while being able to put AI out there? How do you detect these biases that may exist in how humans interact, but because it's a machine, you need to be able to not only detect it, but you need to be able to mitigate it quite immediately. And I think that's an evolution of what we're seeing in the market today of what is probably one of the most important factors to be able to address for organizations to put more AI in their most essential workloads.
And I think it would also make us analyze who's in the room when we're coding the future. Because it's not enough just to have somebody that's going to do their best to ensure there are no biases. But if you don't have diversity in the room, now it's really going to matter, because this is the code to the future. We're rewriting laws in a way. And so, Ketty, on the topic of data and integrity, Harvard Business Review recently released an article called "Why You Shouldn't Swear at Siri." The article went on to say, abuse towards these bots in the future will likely cost you your job. So talk to us about why it's so important that we actually treat these digital devices with agency and with respect, and why going forward it could, and I say personally, would cost you your job.
Yeah, so there's two parts.
Now I'm trying, before she answers that, I'm trying to think, how many times have I actually done
And
that?
Apple has that on file, and they've talked about that. So we don't need to go into that.
There's two parts of that system, of that question. So one, if you, like we've talked about before, if you are retraining or continuing to train your model and learn from human behavior, and that behavior is negative or derogatory in some way, that is going to influence the behavior of the algorithm itself. So a lot of that responsibility is also on the individual that designed the algorithms, as we've said. So making sure to put in safeguards in place to prevent that kind of behavior. And a lot of that is also on the side of the individual interacting with these kind of systems. So if there's a bot, this is my personal opinion, by the way, super personal. If there's if you're interacting with like a bot on Twitter or with a chat bot and you're creating conversations that are negative, you're just going to introduce those kind of cycles. So being kind of conscious and aware in the same way that you interact with other human beings, not like, letting out other kinds of, basically just having your interactions be the same, whether your interaction is on like a social media platform or it's on like in person or it's in a different kind of fashion, and whether you're interacting with a human being or with something else, because maybe at some point you won't be able to tell whether you're interacting.
And I think it's important that we have this question today because data never goes away. So as devices get smarter, who you were 5 years ago or today or in 10 years, that's still on the same track record. So you want the bot to learn the best version of you so it can be the best supporter of you. And so now I want to move into a topic of artificial intelligence that we'll all be interacting with very shortly, and that's autonomous vehicles. Put up your hand if you would feel safe driving in an autonomous vehicle right now. So the room was kind of split. And Professor Dar, I know you published and wrote a model that helps us understand when we have to or should let go and just trust the robots, and when we shouldn't. What does your model say about autonomous vehicles? How should we be thinking about it, and how are governments thinking about it?
I was here in Bloomberg on Friday talking to Tom Keene on the show in the morning, and I thought we were going to talk about finance, but he really wanted to talk about navigation. And the recent tragedies of these two twin crashes is on everyone's mind, and that's brought this question to the fore as to when, should we really be trusting machines with these, to what extent do we let them act autonomously? I'm actually surprised at the poll. Maybe people didn't want to put up their hands. I was surprised at how many people said they'd be comfortable.
We have a progressive crowd. I'm really proud of the crowd.
In a driverless car, because I've driven in one, and I was initially terrified, but I sort of got more comfortable because at one point the machine, we were driving on Mercer Street and there was a lot of construction, and it just said, I'm not going to do this. And so I was pleased that it knew its limitations. Right? So,
How do you communicate that?
like you have this famous line from Dirty Harry, man's don't know his limitations. And so I was pleased that in this case the machine knew its limitations. But the way I sort of look at this issue of trust really is in terms of how often is the machine going to be wrong, and when it's wrong, how bad will things be, right? And in my experience, it's the interplay of those two things that really determines whether we trust machines or not. There's all kinds of problems where, online advertising, sure, you trust an algorithm, it's just going to throw out ads at you and you just ignore them, right? So the costs of error are not high. But in the driverless car, the costs of error are very high. You could kill occupants, worse still, you kill a whole bunch of people. So we as a society really sort of need to come to grips with sort of putting costs on even these rare events, right? So, and the thing is that you don't really, even though on average, driverless cars might reduce accidents and save lives, what really you care about in those kinds of situations is not the average, but the worst case. I mean, I use machine learning all the time. I created, arguably the first machine learning hedge fund out there, and we trade all the time, and the machine makes these decisions, and it's wrong roughly half the time. But as are humans. But that's a very calculated decision. You sort of have an expectation of like how much you're going to lose, how often will you be wrong, and you sort of do an expected value calculation. You can't do that with an aircraft or a driverless car, right? And you can't do an expected value calculation and say, on average, it will save X lives, because unless you really understand these sort of what I call these Rumsfeldian unknowns, the worst case consequences of those, it's very hard to trust the machine. So unless you really know what's going to happen in the worst case, I'd say that you don't trust the machine. It's not that humans will do better. Humans might actually do worse, but that's the way we've always done things. And so we're much more forgiving of humans than we are of machines for many kinds of tasks.
And I know most of us are probably familiar with the classic ethical dilemma with driverless cars. And if you're not, I'll quickly reiterate it. If the vehicle is ever in a situation where it has to decide between, say, swerving left and killing a child, or swerving right and killing a senior, how do we program that? How do we program the value of human life?
The scene.
And I feel like we've been having this conversation for years now. So Rithika, as somebody that works at one of the biggest tech companies, where are we with these types of ethical conversations? Or is it actually more of a question of liability? And who do we blame?
Well, if it's a question of liability, you won't make as much progress as we need to be able to get these technologies out there in the market. I think from a progress standpoint, what I'm seeing is that a lot of organizations, including ourselves and including like my particular team, we are putting ethics at the forefront of everything that we do in how we develop our artificial intelligence technologies. And one of the things that we have is an AI ethics group inside where we talk about the issues in and around AI ethics, how we want to not only build the technologies, but how we want to bring these technologies out to the market with AI ethics in mind and at the forefront of everything that we do. So it's about, I think, first starting as an organization and understanding that it's important to take responsibility for that and to make that a topic that is first of mind, and to be able to communicate that out more externally. And then to work with others in the community to be able to help them establish that. So I think it starts inside first to establish kind of what you need, and then to be able to expand out from there.
And would society ever be included in that conversation? And I know that there was a study done in Europe where they posed that ethical dilemma question: would you rather save a child or sacrifice yourself? And initially everybody said, save the child, save the child. But when it came down to programming their car with that as a permanent response, they didn't want to do it. So, and that's a way to potentially shift the liability. At the end of the day, in those split decisions, would we actually just choose ourselves? And so how included are we going to be in those conversations? And from a company standpoint, that might actually be a better option.
So when I talk about, starting with like an organization, it includes your community and your client with that. Like, so from our perspective, where we're developing technologies for organizations, it starts with talking about it not only internally, but talking about it externally, and to bring in bringing in the community as part of that conversation, because it's really important that these decisions aren't made in isolation. It is a community topic, and it is really important at all levels of society. So not only for organizations like us that are developing the technology, not only for our clients, but also for the end users of that technology as well.
And I think one of my favorite quotes from the chief Watson scientist was, how do we decide what the values are and whose values do we use? Depending on where you are in the world, we value children, elderly differently. So I think that's an important question. Now I want to move on to a much anticipated topic, the future of work. And I want to start with reading you guys the results from a study done by 350 data scientists on their forecasts for the future of work. So the study said AI is expected to be better equipped than humans to write a high school essay by 2026, work in retail by 2031, write a best-selling book by 2049, and perform open heart surgery by 2053. So would we, as experts, agree with those projections?
I would say on some of those, probably even earlier. Right. I mean, I look at the progress that we're making in Project Debater, which is, I don't know whether any of you guys have heard of that, but it's the ability for using our AI technologies to be able to reason and speak and to be able to debate as a human does. So we can do that almost equivocally as well as a human. So I would argue that some of those things we're able to do now. But I think, I want to give the room an analogy here. Think about when electricity was invented. Think about how that changed every job and every profession when electricity was generated. We're at that moment with AI as well. I like to tell, you don't think so? I really do believe so. I believe that every profession and every job will change because of artificial intelligence. And it's a matter of time. It's a matter of the when. I think AI is not a thing. It is not the thing. It's the thing that makes all the other processes around it and the tasks around it better. And so, we have interviewed well over 5,000 C-level executives where we have kind of had the discussion of, this is about when it really comes to adoption of AI and what that means within your organization. It is not just about a technology. It is about a culture change. It is about a process change. It is about organizational changes that need to happen. And it means that you have to reskill your organization, because every job across every job that exists across the organization is going to have to change at some level to be able to accommodate what AI can do. Whether that be predicting better things, optimizing better things, or automating those things.
And Professor Dar, I know you've written about this as well. What would be your take on this?
Well, I was just disagreeing to introduce a little tension.
Let's do it.
I'm Canadian, so that had me worried for a minute.
No, I actually agree with almost everything that Ritika said, except the electricity part. I think that it's clearly a transformational sort of technology will change a lot of things. It's already changing lots of things. And it's, coming back to the work part, clearly it will replace certain kinds of tasks. It may actually replace a lot of drivers, which may not be a bad thing in the long run. So it'll replace a lot of things. But I think, and this is something we don't really understand enough at this point, but it'll change the nature of what people do. Right? It'll change the nature of work. If you go to a physician now, the nature of interaction is completely different from what it would have been 2 years ago. I went to see a doctor the other day. I'm sort of approaching middle age, and sort of more things start going wrong with you. But the nature of interaction was just completely different. Right? He showed up with an iPad, and my general practice GP had sent me there, and he said, "Oh, so you're here for the calcification test," and he pulls out his notepad and says, "Well, let's before we think about whether we should do the test, let's see what happens if your test comes out perfect versus it comes out terrible." Right? So he enters these things, And he said, okay, your risk of heart attack in the worst case went from 3.8% in the next 10 years to 5.6, and in the best case it goes down to 1.8. How do you feel about that? I said, not bad. But it's good to know that, and he said, well, this is what the machine is saying. And he says, now, it may not be based on the same demographic that you belong to, you're South Asian, this is basically, mostly on white males, or maybe different, but it's, ballpark, and I can see that in the next 10 years, the machine will have fleshed out the distribution for all ethnic groups, and maybe that estimate will be more valuable. It doesn't really get rid of the need for the physician. It just changes the nature of what the physician does. And if you see sort of what's going on these days, a lot of technology is productivity enhancing as well, right? So the doctor shouldn't have to spend as much time transcribing, entering stuff. You should be able to talk to the machine, or the machine should be able to recognize his or her scribble, right? So there's all of that stuff where AI is going to come in and make people more productive and change the nature of what they do. So as much as I realize that certain things will get replaced, certain jobs and professions will get replaced, that may not be a bad thing, and will elevate the rest of humanity to do stuff better because the machines are doing more of the sort of heavy lifting for us and helping us focus on the more creative tasks, right? So that would be sort of my optimistic pitch.
And I would agree with that. And I have a follow-up question. As somebody that works in education, and so the World Economic Forum just published an article that said the learn, work, retire model is a thing of the past. That's not going to work in our generation anymore. We're going to have a life of continuous learning. So when you had mentioned Project Debater can execute a conversation or a debate almost similar to a lawyer or getting close. In the school system, are we adjusting for that? So now that we know lawyers are going to walk out into a world where there are project debaters, are we educating them in a way that their skill set is now able to navigate, or is there a lag? Are we behind?
Well, I don't know so much about debaters, but I'm working with some educators as well, and I think there's much more of a need to use technology to educate kids better. Right? So and I think there's huge scope there. Right? So we're working with a nonprofit on getting people's reading skills up earlier. I'm working with another company in India where we're focusing on getting 5 to 10-year-old kids to learn basic concepts in math and literacy so that they don't get left behind. Right? So there's a lot of people who get left behind because teachers don't have time for them. There isn't that potential for individual focus. And so one of the things that AI sort of also brings to the table is it sort of turbocharges a machine so that they can sort of personalize stuff for you, right? So you get on and the machine knows who you are, where you are in your math or literacy or whatever, and it can sort of fine-tune its advice to you, which is very difficult for teachers to do, right? They just don't have that sort of with every single student.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of scope for using machines to enhance basic primary education before we worry about making them into expert debaters.
But I think, to add to that just for a moment, just think about for a moment, just like artificial intelligence has to continually learn to get smarter, what's so different about us? What is so different about us? And especially with the rate and pace at which technology is changing. I will tell you that personally, throughout my career, I have always taken courses, and I think the learning platforms that exist out there, I mean, even from our perspective and where I'm at right now, we are working on an AI learning platform. Why? Because if we're gonna have the skills change, that means that all of you out there, which is why I'm assuming you're here because you're interested in this topic, are gonna have the things that you're gonna have to do to be able to transform and rise up to what it means to have artificial intelligence in your worlds. That means that the learning platforms that exist out there will also have to rise up to that. And I think we're seeing that. I think that we'll continue to see that level up.
Right. And put up your hand if you consider yourself a creative in the room.
That's a great number.
And so there's this misconception that we creatives are potentially immune. And so one of the examples that I like to give was Watson. In 2016, so this is 3 years ago, it worked with 20th Century Fox to produce the first ever AI-made trailer. So they had Watson analyze all of these trailers for a horror film, and then left it up to Watson to make the trailer for this new film. Not only was Watson able to select the best scenes, the best sound, the best music, the director was floored, and Watson did it in a few hours. So we creatives are not immune. But I want to touch on a little bit more when you suggested how we change our perspective about work. One of my favorite futurists, Alexander Manu, he wrote this, and I want to see your response. So after industrialization, humans, we lost our sense of purpose. We started to look at life as a series of activities instead of a series of moments. Artificial intelligence will force us to reimagine our purpose in life. And I think that's a good thing. I think part of the fear with AI is we see our purpose as our life, as our career. And what AI is going to do is force us to rethink what it means to work. We won't necessarily have a work-life balance, but a life-life balance. And what would you guys say to that? Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will change how we approach certain problems, even creative problems. So, I mean, a lot of what we're saying is problems are going to be approached from more of a data-driven approach. So a lot of the times when something would be intuitive or you just have the gut reaction, then you have additional data points for making decisions, whether it's making policy decisions or it's like court cases or it's making movie trailers, but it will be an additional signal. So a lot of it will be kind of how you interpret what the output is from these algorithms, how you interpret your role. So whether, for example, as a journalist, I mean, you want to find why some things are happening, try to find like a fuller story in terms of explanation instead of just routinely, identifying events that are happening in news. In the same way, you don't want to be spending hours of time editing footage if you just need to make some directional changes. And the creative aspect really doesn't come into play from the hours of time spent on something. It's from the vision you have or the direction you have. And I think that's a lot of what you can tap into in terms of your creative potential.
And I think, I believe that we have a moral obligation to have the conversations today that people will live with tomorrow. In the next 50 to 60 years, we can agree that AI and advanced technologies will be able to do almost everything that we can do today, which means we will hopefully have more time to do what we love. But we can't ignore the potential economic reality of that. What does that society look like? How do we sustain? And so some of the popular solutions or theories are things like universal basic income. And I would want everybody here to hear it from an expert. What are your thoughts on that as a potential state of the world? And for anyone who doesn't know what UBI is, if we get to a point in society where technology can perform all of the jobs and where we're free to kind of live our life, how do we would get a certain segment of money from government month after month, where we can pay by the tech companies that are around, and that's how we would sustain. What are your thoughts and opinions on that?
That's a pretty hard topic to be able to give an opinion about, but I will tell you, from the conversation of AI and impact and your commentary that you had before, I think I told you before we started this, I have 2 young kids, and my daughter happens to sit with me every night while I do my work, and she'll sometimes ask me what's the latest happenings with Watson, and and she could probably give a pitch better than I could on some days, just because she understands it at that level. But she asked me one day, she's like, "Mommy, with Watson and AI, what does that mean for what I'm going to do when I grow up?" And the answer, I had to think about it for a moment, and I was like, honey, the reality is your job probably hasn't even been invented. And so I think when we really think about what it means for AI to transform every job, every profession, every part of our society, it does become pretty profound in terms of most of the jobs out there 50 to 60 years from now, they probably haven't even been invented yet. We don't know what they are. The jobs that are going to be optimized, we can't even imagine the ways in which they're going to be optimized at this point. So, I mean, when I think about it, you can either resist the change in terms of the transformation that's going to happen, or you can embrace it. And when I think about what it means to embrace it, I think about leveraging artificial intelligence in terms of how do you augment the human at this point? How do you become better because you're using AI in some form of your job? How do you then, for the second point, really think about it in a way where you have society and ethical decision-making behind it? And the third is, what are you doing to kind of have the skills and embrace what that means, and to be able to leap forward and start reimagining what that means for your career?
Professor Dara, in the academic world, are you having these conversations about a potential post-work world and what that would look like economically?
Yeah, I was hoping I could just duck that question.
I can see
and
you.
you'd sort of move on. I don't know. I think the whole UBI thing is it's just an idea. I'm kind of skeptical. I think humans have sort of an inherent drive, a curiosity. I just can't imagine people sitting around at home doing nothing. I mean, that would be a pretty sad state of affairs to be in. So, I mean, if we ever reach that just point, things have probably gone very badly wrong, and UBI is not going to help us. So that's my...
And I think it's important, though, that we have that conversation versus learn about it in Black Mirror. I think it's better than other experts. And so I want to move into the next section of regulation and security. So artificial intelligence, advanced technologies in general in the United States aren't very regulated. It's more of a self-regulation that a company regulates, which means when it comes to a government level or a national security level, government is leaning a bit more on the private sector to learn about the innovations. And so when it comes to IBM, for example, if you come across a part of the technology in your research and development that you realize that this was in the wrong hands or in the hands of the wrong country, this could pose a national security risk to us. Are you obligated to report that to the government so then they can look for it, be sure other countries aren't doing it? Because it's not like we can code it, somebody else can. Or are we so passive that there isn't even a system there?
So at IBM, we firmly believe that when we see our technologies being used, or that they potentially could be used for wrongdoing, we do not do that business. That is to say, when we find that there are uses of the technology that don't mirror the ethics that we have as a company, the virtues that we have as a company, we don't.
But do you report that and say we came across this and this could be used in the wrong way, in the wrong hands? Or do we just leave that unknown?
So on that particular piece, I think we stay away from those kinds of businesses, and where we need to be able to address that, we address that. And I think your point on does that exist for every organization is a great question. We believe that when we use our technology, we want to make sure that it's in the hands where it's being used for good, where it aligns with the values that we have as a company. And I think that's something that today is in the hands of individual organizations and individual groups. We're starting to see, I would say, more interest in from worldwide government organizations to start looking at the ethics and the use of these technologies. But it's in its infancy right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, here it is, and I know in countries like China, for example, they are investing in AI at a rapid rate. And I know we spoke about this a little bit on the phone. But when it comes to security and regulation, the U.S. in a good way is passive to allow innovation, but then it makes you wonder, if we can do it, what can everybody else do? And on the same note of ensuring that we get educated through the right sources, I would like to ask your opinions on a concept of technological singularity. and on the idea of risk. So this would be the risks that we fear of the AI itself. Technological singularity is when we hit a critical mass where the technology is exponentially smarter than humans, which means we may lose control. And we see it in a lot of movies, but then we also hear about it from people like Stephen Hawking or Elon Musk. As experts, what are your opinions on this? And I don't think it's something that we should worry about in a way to stop inventing and innovating, but I think we'd be foolish to not have the conversation.
So I want to actually tie this to your earlier question on regulation, because we didn't quite explore that fully enough. So this is the area that concerns me the most. And I wrote about it in a Washington Post article in September about sort of what I see as 4 models of data that have emerged. Right? So the way I look at it, algorithms are neutral, data are not, especially their use. And essentially what I see is sort of the US model, which is laissez-faire, Wild West. If you've got the data, use it. Regulators are sort of looking the other way. It's a free market. And however it was acquired, if you can get advantage through it, go for it. Right? So that's sort of the US model. And then you have sort of the European model, which is basically, no, wait a minute, like data belongs to the individuals who create it, who generate it, and there's certain protections that we want around that. And I think GDPR is actually a pretty well thought out framework, and I think Europe's kind of ahead of most people in thinking about this. And then I see sort of the Indian model of data, which is geared towards sort of inclusion, right? 60% of the people are outside the economic mainstream. How do you get them to get an identity to begin with, right? Basically an ID. How do you get them the ability to get credit? You know, because people don't even have an ID. Like half the people in India, prior to this sort of national biometric system being rolled out, didn't have an ID, right? People had no idea who they were. Right? So the approach there has been sort of inclusion. And you have the Chinese model, which is basically oriented around control, right? And that scares me, frankly, because the Chinese government really hasn't taken permission from anyone on what to do or how to do it. They've just gone ahead and done it. And to me, that's frightening, frankly, when you have the technology, and the technology exists, by the way, to recognize anyone. The technology exists to track anyone. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that we can't be tracked by the government instantly, right? But we haven't given our government permission to do that yet, and they need to ask us that, right? And that's sort of what I find to be sort of the most frightening part, is that when sovereigns engage in that kind of activity where they can exercise complete control. And there was a frightening article in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend called the Something's Toolkit, which essentially was talking about this very problem, that we ought to be really careful about what we allow powerful entities who have the data to do with it, right? And we've seen, in this country, we've seen a sort of embarrassment around Facebook and what they've done, and now they're constantly sort of in the back foot and apologizing. But that's a business, and we can sort of understand that, right? The business's obligation is to the shareholders, and they're going to exploit the data for value, right? It's kind of what you can expect. But we clearly need regulation around that, because the unbridled use of data could not, could be potentially, not beneficial to us. When you ask the same questions about what's happening globally, what are the potential consequences of something like that, and that's something we need to worry about, and people are active about.
And it begs the question then, if other countries are doing it, are we better off at least just keeping up, so we know what is possible or what could be done?
Well, it's not like we're behind in the technology, right? The US is at the forefront of AI technology, and most of the innovation still occurs here. So it's not like we're behind in the basic capabilities. We just haven't implemented it for those purposes yet.
I think in addition to the data components and kind of how we actually treat the data, the other that kind of addresses, what does it mean to have the adoption is, how do you start explaining? You have an algorithm now. It takes a whole bunch of data. It makes some sort of prediction or some sort of optimization. How do you trust that? How do you trust the decision that AI is making? Whether you get a loan or not, whether you get car insurance or not. If you think about it, in every aspect of your life, when there is a decision to be made, if AI is helping to make that decision, the question is going to be not only what data was used to be able to create the AI that's making that decision, but do you have trust in the outcome that's happening? So this is, at least, for the enterprises I work with, one of the top reasons, 60% of CXOs say that the governance of understanding how AI is making a decision and what factors went into making that decision is probably one of the top reasons why they have not yet embraced AI. But I kind of see it similarly to where, if you guys think of compilers, like the things that kind of run the code on the machine that, that basically take a whole bunch of input and create some sort of output, nobody really understands exactly how a compiler works. And AI is in that same way. And just as compilers have matured over time, AI will too, but there's a need to be able to say, I want a way to be able to trace and understand and explain the decisions that were made.
And I will say, as a message of hope, in France they are now implementing that if AI does make a decision about you should go to jail, you should get a loan, you legally have to be shown what data was used and how it was calculated. And I think that will hopefully migrate over here. And so I want to move into the last section of the night, and that's with our personal relationships with artificial intelligence. So AI, I will preface by saying AI will be an incredible support for humans, whether it's companionship for mental illness, to taking care of elderly. But then there's this other category, and we have famous roboticists like David Hansen, who believe our relationships may be marital. We already know that they're physical when it comes to AI, but that they may even be granted civil rights, or at least protected rights. And I think it's important we have this conversation from a serious perspective, because what we don't want is AI and robots to become this outlet of abuse for humans. So we have to address it seriously. But what are your thoughts on how open our society will eventually become?
How open it will become to the use of AI?
The personal use of AI, the idea of relationships with these robots.
So can I answer a slightly easier question? So there was you're making me think of, could people fall in love with machines or have emotional
Exactly that question.
connections with machines? And there was an off-Broadway play I saw about, someone who falls in love with a machine. That's all sort of science fiction, but I think that, one of the sort of trends that has become clear is that we've become increasingly wedded to our personal assistant in our pocket, right? And that, if you call it a relationship, will continue to become more and more personal and more intimate. So in that sense, I think we'll get closer to machines just through our, personal devices. Hard to say, how emotional that will be. Someone asked me the other day, could you imagine getting into an emotional relationship with a machine? I was like, gee, I don't know, what do you have in mind? R2D2 or Ex Machina? On what the imagery is.
Yeah, and I think as it will also depend on how the technology advances, as the cognitive abilities start to develop faster and more in depth. It could be a conversation. I'd like to revisit it in 5 to 10 years and see where we are. And my final question for the night, and this is for each and every one of you. Right now, it is one of the most important times in our history, because we have the opportunity to build a new world through technology. A world where nobody's left behind and nobody is disconnected. So as experts in the field, with the amount of knowledge that you possess on the most important technology of this generation, what are you doing personally to ensure that it's built on the right side of history?
Who's starting?
Well, I'm thrilled, I'm excited, but I'm also frightened. And so what I'm doing about the frightening side is just writing about it and trying to get lawmakers to think more deeply about it. So that's what I'm trying to do, is just get, because lawmakers and regulators often tend to be sort of behind the eight ball, and in this case they have been. So my objective is really to sort of engage in that conversation with policymakers and just get them up to speed so they can start making intelligent decisions. Because I think that'll have a huge impact on the way society shapes up.
I personally think that artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, is going to impact every part of our life. And so if you think about the things that you learned when you were in school, reading, writing, and arithmetic, I think there are two other aspects that AI is really going to impact. And that is, not only can you code, I mean, I think programming and coding is the reading of tomorrow. And I think it's really important to be able to infuse that as a subject that is just as important. And I'll go into kind of what I personally am doing there, as well as what I'm proud that our organization is doing. The second is, if you think about all the topics we just talked about in addition to technology, it's about a real culture shift, and it's almost philosophy in nature. And so, it's interesting when I have people come ask me for mentorship advice, and they're like, I really want to understand a little bit more about AI. I say, not only go learn how to code, but the elements of philosophy and become extremely important, especially in the discussion that we just had, and what it means to be able to take some of these issues to hand. So from a personal standpoint, I personally work with schools and help them code, but I'm also proud to be part of an organization where we've taken that seriously. We've put over 170 P-Tech schools, which are basically to be able to help those people who want to go back into the workforce for these new collar jobs, whether it be in artificial intelligence and cloud computing. I think that's really important because this whole discussion we have tonight about the impact of reskilling, that's going to be extremely, extremely important. And so I think providing a foundation that doesn't require you, as you talked about, to go to a 4-year school to be able to get that is extremely important. So I know our organization's dedicated to that from an IBM perspective, but personally for me, it's also about putting that time to be able to create platforms, to be able to work with children at a much earlier age, because it is the reading, writing, and arithmetic of our generation.
From my perspective, so I work in the artificial intelligence group on the engineering side at Bloomberg, so I build statistical models that are used in these production systems. So a lot of it is trying to make sure that decisions are made with the right time. They're not rushed. They're made with the right people in the room, with the right considerations, and verified, double-checked in terms of what are the implications, what are the consequences of how things could go wrong, and a lot of cases where we want to make sure that we don't have negative consequences, either on our clients or on others as well. In terms of the kind of Bloomberg as a whole, both like internally and externally, it's a very kind of supportive environment where we have internal kind of, and I'm personally involved in this as well, where we have meetups and like these kind of conversations, even hackathons for even like software engineers who are not familiar with artificial intelligence, because coding is not enough. You also need to know statistics and machine learning and other aspects of it. Or journalists and like news editors or sales or business counterparts that are interested in learning more about this area and how to use these data points in their decision-making process. So a lot of these efforts around education, both internally and externally, that I do personally as well as that Bloomberg does for a lot of different, especially at different groups.
Well, now we'll open up for a few quick questions. We do have a mic that we can pass around.
Hi, I just had a question about the human element. I mean, I have a cell phone, and a smartphone, and I can do so many more things than I used to be able to do. But at the same time, I don't feel that it's made me happier. And I just wanted to ask how that plays in here.
I guess my question would be, what do you think would make you happier?
No, but like, I mean, for a serious answer, I mean, there are a lot of like, I mean, in terms of entertainment or a lot of other aspects, artificial intelligence can help you and technology can help you, but a lot of the times you structure your own life and your own priorities, and I think a lot of it is kind of what you were saying in terms of how do we structure our priorities or values, and in this setting of technology and how human interactions are changing, how do we maintain those values or prioritize the interactions that we want to have.
And I will say, we have things like social media, we're still adjusting to the entrance of these technologies and these behaviors. So right now, we don't have it all figured out. But I think in time, we will realize the right time balance. We will have better monitoring on things like social media. We will understand the behavioral aspect of how we use technology. But right now, we're still getting used to it. But I think there's still a lot of room for growth.
Can I also provide an answer? So I think that, I think I see where you're coming from, and I think that maybe you just want to try being away from the device for several hours at a time. You know, because, and I'm not saying that flippantly, because I think that you ride in the subway, everyone's sort of looking at the devices. I think we've sort of lost a little bit of that humanity of just like what it means to be human, which means you just sort of relax, to talk to people, to sort of just get away from the device. And you know, I mean, I spent half of my life without technology, you know, pre-internet, and I think in many ways I was a lot happier then, and not being tracked. Not having expectations about why didn't you respond to my email if I sent it 3 hours ago. We've become sort of tethered and sort of in danger of becoming slaves to our devices. And so I always plead with my kids, like, could you please just leave that device alone for a few hours? And you know, with both of them, I think it's done good when they do. And I certainly feel a lot better when I just walk away from my device for several hours during the day and just give myself time to think or do things that are more human.
I think I'll just do, technology can be used for good and it can be used for bad. Just like anything else. I think part of that is finding, I think, that right balance of what is good and what is bad, like figuring that out.
We're learning that, I think, as a society.
Data and AI is wreaking basic havoc on our cognitive and political systems, as shown in the 2016 election. The AI ran ads that were run on Facebook. There is a theory now that AI is creating YouTube videos for children. I don't know if you guys heard about that. 2017, there was a think piece, I think, in Medium about it, called Something is Wrong with the Internet. Where is our responsibility beyond just being good parents to our children and teaching and educating? You know, I don't have children myself, but how do we educate our kids to embrace, you know, this new era and new world? And have we already let it out of Pandora's box? And just one more thing, actually, today the Stanford Institute announced a new thing called the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. That was announced today. They coined the term artificial intelligence. So they're now coming back and saying, wait, we need to have humans control AI. Is that saying that it's gone out of Pandora's box and we can't get it back?
As a neutral party, I will say technology is actually a really interesting, an interesting space because we play catch up with regulation. So the innovations happen because it's so cheap, it's scalable, and then we realize where the impact is. The goal, I think, would be as we look retrospectively and realize this is kind of what happens, here are some of the negative situations. The goal would be that regulation can get ahead. But right now, as we're kind of in a strange disruption time where regulation is a few steps back. And that will improve when we have more private and public sector involvement and working together. But I think it is a little bit of a scary time that regulation is a little bit behind. I don't know if the experts want to speak.
I agree, but that's a really hard question that you raised, and I'm not sure there is an answer to that. It's related to what the lady asked earlier. It's just sort of, how do we reclaim our humanity? Well, that's up to us, right? And we just need to walk away from the technology. You don't like Facebook, you need to walk away from it and just do something else. And it's hard because these things are addictive, they're seductive, and so they're like, on the one hand, they're sort of pulling us in, so it just makes it all the more hard to step away from it, but I don't see another way around that.
Yeah, I probably don't need a microphone. In listening to the questions that are brought up about the interaction between artificial intelligence and human beings, I feel like when we struggle to answer those questions, a lot of times they center around who we are. It turns the mirror back to us. So the outlet is, that's a difficult question. It's forcing you to say, what kind of human being are you? So if you think about your relationship with artificial intelligence, think about it as being a parent. You're raising a child. When you have a child, you start to think to yourself, what kind of person am I? How do I have to change to raise this a better entity? So if we look at artificial intelligence as an extension of who we are, as opposed to this separate entity that's going to make our lives easier, it might help us to navigate some of those difficult questions.
Yeah, and I will agree, and hence why we shouldn't swear at Siri. They kind of tie it all back in, but I think that data will eventually see. We have to have more agencies over technologies. And I think we have time for one more question, okay? And I will leave it up to the mic dispensers to answer this.
There's been a lot of talk about ethics and education on the panel, and I am just curious if there is, it sounds as if you're kind of implying that there's a need to bring humanities, particularly philosophy and ethics, into this, but I'm only hearing that people are creating courses for kids to code, and I would imagine that there needs to be kind of the same extent, if not greater need, to actually think about this as an ethical thing, and should we be modernizing our philosophy or our humanities, because that is something that I feel like is a dying situation. And I know, like, for one of my friends actually came into, I'll just call it the G company, as a philosopher and as a coder to help with some of these larger issues. However, they really got marginalized at the end of the day because we live in an economy where it's based on eyeballs on your screen and screen time. So I guess like my question is, great if you're kind of doing coding, but are you or do you know other people who are modernizing the philosophy and the ethics?
I know from our perspective, we're actually working with a few academic institutions to be able to work on, actually with the humanities groups and with the philosophy groups, to be able to really understand the questions and how the curriculum and universities, et cetera, need to change. That's the first thing. So we're starting to do that proactively already because, we do think the humanities, philosophy, all of these things are really going to be just as important as the technology itself. That's number one. Number two is think about this now as the technology is being expanded to almost every corporation, every part of your life, every organization. That means that there's some training that has to happen in these organizations, in these businesses, in these environments, and that's also something that we're taking to heart, and we'll start to see that more and more now, where there'll actually be like courses to be able to help organizations think about these questions. But it's not as, if you think about ethics and kind of the characteristics that are needed, it's not really as easy as saying, okay, let me teach you a process, right? It's at the root of who you are as an organization too. So there are things that I think, questions that you can raise areas that you need to be able to focus on, and I think we're starting to do that with academic institutions as well as being able to teach organizations kind of the things that they need to think about. But it goes beyond just let me teach you a process.
And I think, and I know we have to wrap up.
Can I just say one
Sure.
thing? I think that's a great question, and I think that everyone should study philosophy, frankly, personally, because I think that unless you do, you don't even know how to ask a question. Right? You don't even know what a good question is, let alone.
A lot of our technology would not even
No, I agree, but I think where Ritika came from earlier about the coding part is that you have to sort of look at it from both ends. I don't think learning how to program replaces the need to learn how to think, right? I think the programming part sort of gives you access and gets you in the game. And that's becoming important. And I see this with all of my students. Unless you actually know how to work with data, you're at a huge disadvantage these days. It doesn't mean that you're at an advantage if you know how to work with data and don't know how to think, right? And as I say, a fool with a tool is still a fool. So I agree completely, and sort of, there can be sort of an overly, too much of a focus on like learn how to code at the expense of learning how to think. So I'm totally on board with that.
And so unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up. But the questions were fantastic, and the point of these conversations are to encourage us to think critically about technology, examine it in all aspects, not just from the code and not just from humanity, but the interaction of the two. So thank you so much for coming here tonight.